Dawn arrives quietly, as if afraid to disturb what remains. The light spreads in a thin, colorless wash over the plain, revealing shapes that do not move. Spears lie where hands release them. Shields rest cracked and open like ribs. The air carries the metallic scent of blood and cooling earth, and beneath it, a deeper silence presses down, heavy as stone. No birds call. Even the wind seems to hesitate, brushing the grass in cautious whispers. You stand in a world that has just ended, and the land has not yet decided how to breathe again. At the center of this stillness stands a single figure. He does not celebrate. He does not kneel. He stands as if listening to something only he can hear. His chest rises slowly. His weapon is lowered but not released, its blade catching the first shard of sunlight. Around him lie the bodies of men who believed, until the final moment, that the old rules still govern the world. They fought as their fathers fought, and their fathers before them. They trusted distance, ritual, the rhythm of inherited war. And here, in the pale light of morning, those traditions lie broken at his feet. Smoke drifts in thin ribbons from smoldering grass. Somewhere, a wounded man exhales his last breath, a soft, animal sound swallowed by the open sky. The figure does not turn toward it. His gaze stretches beyond the field, beyond the horizon, as if he is already measuring the next shape of the world. There is no triumph in his posture, only certainty. Something irreversible has occurred here. The land itself seems to recognize it. This is not merely a victory. It is an announcement. You can feel it in the air. An old order collapsing, a new one stepping forward in human form. He stands at the seam between eras, and the silence around him is the silence of history taking note. In that moment, he is less a man than a force, the embodiment of an idea sharpened into flesh. War has been rewritten, and the author is still breathing. Who is this man who has turned a battlefield into a threshold? What kind of childhood hardens into such clarity? What kind of world demands a king forged not in ceremony, but in collision? Long before the field fell quiet, he was a child watching from the margins. His earliest memories are not of belonging, but of edges. The edge of the circle where elders spoke in voices that did not include him. The edge of the firelight where laughter dimmed when he approached. The edge of his settlement that tolerated his presence, but never embraced it. He learned early the geography of exclusion. There were places you could stand and places you could not, and the difference between them was enforced not by walls, but by glances. The land itself offered no softness. The soil was stubborn, the seasons unreliable. Hunger was a familiar companion, not dramatic enough to terrify, only persistent enough to shape the body. Dust clung to skin. Wind scoured the hills. The people who survived here were carved by necessity into something lean and alert. He grew among them, absorbing their hardness the way stone absorbs heat. Every insult, every dismissal, settled inside him not as weakness, but as pressure, compressing into a private density he could not yet name. At night, he lay awake listening to the distant chants of warriors returning from raids, their voices rising and falling like waves against the dark. The sound carried promise and exclusion in equal measure. Those chants belonged to men who had crossed a boundary he was forbidden even to approach. He pictured them in the firelight, bodies painted, eyes bright with the intimacy of shared danger. He imagined the circle closing around them, sealing them inside a brotherhood he could see but not touch. The ache of that distance became a teacher. It taught him to watch. Observation became his refuge and his weapon. He studied everything, the way older boys square their shoulders to appear larger, the way disputes were settled with ritualized gestures before violence was allowed to bloom, the way fear hid behind bravado, flickering in the corners of men's eyes just before they struck. He learned the grammar of power without being granted a single word. Watching from the edges, he discovered that exclusion sharpens perception. When you're not allowed to participate, you become an archivist of human behavior. The landscape instructed him as ruthlessly as any elder. He learned where water gathered after rain, how grass bent before storm, how silence could signal danger long before sound arrived. Survival here was not heroic. It was attentive. Each day demanded small acts of intelligence. Reading tracks, rationing strength, recognizing when pride must yield to patience. These lessons accumulated quietly, layering inside him until survival itself began to feel insufficient. To live at the mercy of circumstance was a form of captivity. He began to sense that safety did not come from endurance alone. It came from control. There were moments when the settlement erupted into sudden hierarchy. Ceremonies where men stood in ordered lines, bodies aligned to invisible principles older than memory. He watched the choreography of authority. Who spoke first, who lowered their eyes, who stepped back. Ritual revealed the skeleton of society. It showed him that power was not random. It was structured, repeated, rehearsed. And if it could be structured, it could be restructured. Whispered insults followed him like a shadow. He heard them even when they were not spoken, felt them in the subtle tightening of faces. Each slight etched a question deeper into him. Why do some stand inside the circle while others orbit forever? Why must belonging be granted instead of taken? The child who endured these questions did not break beneath them. He folded them inward, storing them like flint. Pain became potential. Rejection became architecture. Sometimes he stood beyond the fires at night and imagined a different geometry. He pictured a circle that did not exclude him, then a circle that existed because of him. In those private visions, fear retreated. The world rearranged itself around a single certainty. Survival was not enough. To live safely, one must rule the conditions of survival. The idea did not arrive as a declaration. It seeped in gradually, like water finding a path through stone, until it was no longer an idea at all, but an instinct. By the time he understood this, the child who watched from the margins had already begun to disappear. In his place stood a young man carrying an invisible blueprint. Every humiliation had become a measurement. Every observation had become a tool. He no longer looked at warriors with longing. He looked at them with calculation. Their strengths were patterns. Their weaknesses were openings. The circle he had once begged to enter was becoming, in his mind, a structure that could be dismantled and rebuilt. The land had taught him endurance. Exclusion had taught him vision. Together they forged a quiet resolve that frightened even him with its clarity. He did not dream of revenge. Revenge was small. He dreamed of redesign. If the world had been arranged to deny him, then the arrangement itself was flawed. And flaws, once recognized, invite correction. You can almost see the moment it crystallizes. A young man standing at the edge of a training ground, dust rising around stamping feet, the air thick with shouted commands. He watches the ritual of inherited war, the repetition of motions sanctified by age. And instead of awe, he feels a sudden, electric distance from it. Tradition no longer appears sacred. It appears inefficient. The realization strikes with the force of revelation. What has always been done is not necessarily what must be done. In that instant, the boundary between observer and architect dissolves. He steps forward not physically, but internally, crossing a threshold no one else can see. The child outside the circle understands that the circle itself is negotiable. The world he was born into is not fixed. It is a draft, and drafts can be rewritten. The battlefield at dawn is still far in the future, but its outline is already present in him. The silence after victory, the solitary figure, the sense of an era closing. All of it begins here, In the mind of a boy who refused to accept the shape of his confinement, pain has matured into ambition. Observation has matured into intention. Survival is about to become design. And once a human being decides to redesign the terms of power, history begins to lean forward, listening. Transformation does not arrive with thunder. It begins in repetition. The young man enters the discipline of war the way others enter prayer, surrendering hours, then days, then entire seasons to a single pursuit. Mastery over the body and the trembling animal hidden inside it. Training strips away the illusions he carried from childhood. Strength is not inherited. It is assembled. Fear is not banished. It is reorganized. Each morning the ground is cold beneath his feet. He runs until the air burns in his throat and the world narrows to the rhythm of impact. Step, breath. Pain is no longer an enemy. It becomes a language, and he learns to read it fluently. Muscles tear and rebuild. Skin hardens. The body becomes an instrument tuned through suffering. Around him, other men chase the same transformation, but he moves through it with a different intensity. He is not training to belong. He is training to redesign the meaning of belonging itself. Weapons that once seemed sacred now appear negotiable in his hands. He studies their balance, their reach, their waste. Why throw a weapon and surrender it to distance? Why rely on hope when certainty can be engineered? These questions haunt him during drills, during meals, during the thin hours before sleep. He begins to experiment in small, private ways, adjusting grip, shortening movement, closing distance faster than custom allows. Tradition resists him at first. It always does. But effectiveness is a persuasive argument. When his methods work, when opponents fall before they understand what has changed, resistance softens into curiosity. War, he realizes, is not chaos. It is a system disguised as ritual. Once you see the system, you can alter its gears. Training becomes ritual rebirth. Every repetition peels away an older version of himself. The boy who watched from the edges dissolves into a man who moves at the center of action. Breath aligns with others. Feet strike earth in unison. There is a strange exhilaration in synchronization, in feeling individual fear dissolve into collective momentum. Yet inside that unity he remains separate, observing even as he participates. He is both soldier and architect, immersed in the machine while mapping its structure. Leadership does not announce itself with speeches. It emerges in the quiet authority of competence. When he moves, others adjust without being told. When he speaks, it is brief and precise, each word chosen for function rather than flourish. Men follow him because he reduces uncertainty. In battle, uncertainty is terror. To stand near someone who seems immune to it is to feel a borrowed courage. He does not charm them. He stabilizes them. The speed of his thinking begins to alter the tempo of those around him. Commands shorten, maneuvers tighten, hesitation shrinks. He treats combat like an engineering problem. Remove inefficiency, reinforce advantage, repeat what works. Efficiency becomes its own form of beauty. Watching a formation execute perfectly is like watching a storm organize itself. There is elegance in precision, and he chases it with the devotion of an artist. Yet mastery extracts a cost. As his effectiveness grows, so does the distance between him and ordinary life. Conversations thin. Laughter feels foreign, a sound from a country he once visited but cannot return to. Others celebrate victories with exuberance. He studies them in silence, already dissecting the encounter, already redesigning the next. Exhilaration flickers through him only in motion, only in the instant when planning meets reality and proves itself correct. Stillness feels empty. He becomes addicted to the clarity of action. Discipline liberates him from fear, but it also seals him inside a narrow corridor. Everything outside the pursuit of perfection fades. Relationships become secondary to structure. Emotion becomes a distraction to be managed. He does not think of this as sacrifice. He thinks of it as necessity. To build something unprecedented, one must abandon the comforts of the familiar. He has abandoned them so completely that he no longer remembers their shape. You can sense the acceleration now. Training grounds blur into battlefields. Battles blur into campaigns. Each success confirms his suspicion that the old rules were never sacred, only unexamined. If war can be redesigned, then the society that wages it can be redesigned as well. The realization expands inside him until it eclipses everything else. He is no longer content to win within a system. He intends to rebuild the system itself. The kingdom that begins to form around him does not grow organically. It is assembled with deliberate force. Scattered groups are drawn into alignment, not merely through conquest, but through redefinition. Loyalty is extracted from the small circles of family and redirected toward a larger abstraction. The state, the structure, the idea of collective identity engineered by a single will. He understands that belonging is the most powerful weapon a leader possesses. If you can reshape what people believe they belong to, you can reshape what they are willing to sacrifice. Ritual becomes architecture. Uniform movements, shared symbols, synchronized ceremonies. These are not decorations. They are scaffolding for a new identity. Men who once fought for clan and blood now fight for a constructed unity that feels older than their memories. He mixes former rivals into the same formations, forcing them to depend on one another until enmity dissolves into necessity. Over time, necessity becomes loyalty. Loyalty becomes pride. A new people emerges, not born but manufactured. From a distance, the kingdom appears unstoppable. Mass drills thunder across the plains, thousands of feet striking earth in perfect rhythm. Voices rise in collective chants that vibrate in the chest of anyone who hears them. Ceremonies unfold on a scale that dwarfs individual life. Standing inside these spectacles, a warrior feels himself expand beyond his own skin. He is part of something vast, something efficient, something terrifyingly ordered. The machine works. At its center stands the architect, calm amid the spectacle. He has transformed exclusion into empire. The circle that once denied him now radiates outward from his position, encompassing territories, languages, and histories that bend toward a single axis. Triumph surrounds him, yet unease hums beneath it. The machine demands constant motion. It must drill, expand, conquer, or it will begin to question itself. Efficiency has a hunger. Once awakened, it does not tolerate idleness. Greatness reveals its paradox here. To maintain perfection, sacrifice must become permanent. Young men surrender their youth to barracks and battle. Families reorganize their lives around the needs of the state. Individual desires are compressed until they fit the shape of collective ambition. The kingdom thrives, but it thrives by consuming the very people who animate it. He sees this and accepts it. In his calculus, stability justifies cost. Order is mercy compared to chaos. He believes this with absolute clarity. And yet, perfection contains the seed of fragility. A system engineered around one mind inherits the limits of that mind. The more precise the structure becomes, the less it tolerates deviation. Cracks, when they appear, travel quickly. He senses this instinctively. It sharpens his vigilance. Trust narrows. Control tightens. The machine that lifted him to unimaginable height begins, almost imperceptibly, to require more than any human being can sustainably give. Standing at the center of his creation, he has achieved what the child outside the circle once imagined, a world rearranged around his will. But the cost of that achievement gathers quietly at the edges. The same discipline that liberated him from fear has isolated him from softness. The same efficiency that unified a people has bound them to relentless motion. The kingdom is perfect and therefore fragile. Somewhere beyond the thunder of drills and the echo of ceremonies, a silence is forming. It is the silence that follows strain, the silence that precedes fracture. He does not hear it yet. He is still listening to the rhythm of the machine, still believing that precision can outpace decay. But history has begun to inhale. And when a system is built around a single man, the smallest tremor inside that man carries the weight of an earthquake. Power at its height has a peculiar loneliness. The higher he stands, the thinner the air becomes, until even language struggles to follow him. In the vast spaces of his residence, footsteps echo with a hollowness that ceremony cannot fill. Advisors speak carefully. Warriors bow deeply. No one meets his eyes without permission. Respect has matured into distance. He has constructed a world that moves precisely as he commands. And within that precision, he begins to feel an unfamiliar instability, as if the ground beneath the machine is shifting in ways only he can sense. The tremor begins with loss. It arrives not as a battlefield defeat or a political betrayal, but as something smaller and infinitely more devastating. A personal absence opens inside him, a silence where a voice once lived. Grief does not strike him with theatrical violence. It seeps. It infiltrates routine. Commands feel heavier. Ceremonies feel hollow. The machine continues to function, but he hears a faint dissonance beneath its rhythm. The architect of order discovers a chaos he cannot outmaneuver. Grief, when it finds no language, transforms into force. He channels it the only way he knows, through control. Mourning becomes policy. Sorrow becomes decree. The kingdom is ordered to mirror the scale of his pain. Rituals of grief expand until they swallow ordinary life. Laughter is suspect. Celebration feels like betrayal. He watches faces for signs of insufficient sorrow, measuring loyalty in tears. The people comply because the machine has taught them to comply, but beneath their obedience, fear begins to ferment into something darker. The machine turns inward. Drills that once prepared men for external enemies now enforce internal vigilance. Suspicion circulates like a hidden current. Whispers replace chants. Glances dart and retreat. The unity he engineered through discipline starts to fracture under the pressure of enforced emotion. He senses disobedience everywhere. Not because it is rampant, but because grief has narrowed his perception until every deviation feels catastrophic. Control, once his instrument, becomes his obsession. Isolation seals around him completely. At the summit of absolute power, there is no equal voice to interrupt his spiral. Advisors echo his fears because survival depends on agreement. Warriors execute his commands because hesitation has been trained out of them. He stands surrounded by thousands, yet no one stands beside him. The loneliness of kings is not poetic exaggeration. It is structural. A hierarchy that elevates a man above all others also removes the hands that might steady him. In the long halls of his residence, silence grows dense. You can imagine him walking alone through those spaces, hearing only the echo of his own steps and the distant murmur of a kingdom straining to keep pace with his sorrow. He has built a structure that amplifies his will. Now it amplifies his anguish. Each order reverberates outward, carrying the weight of a private wound in a public life. The cost is counted in executions, in families torn apart, in a population learning to breathe carefully. This is the moment when control begins to resemble self-destruction. The qualities that forged his empire, discipline, certainty, refusal to yield, turn against him. He cannot soften without betraying the identity that sustained him. He cannot continue without deepening the damage. The paradox tightens. Power without balance reveals its final shape, a cage built from victory. The kingdom feels it. Even those who cannot name the shift sense that the air has thickened. Warriors who once marched with pride now march with dread coiled in their stomachs. Chiefs speak in guarded phrases. Loyalty becomes performance. The machine still moves, but its rhythm has changed. It no longer sings of expansion. It grinds. When a system is built around one man, his fracture becomes the kingdom's fracture. The people do not separate his suffering from their fate. They experience it as weather, as an unavoidable climate imposed from above. And like all climates, it provokes adaptation. Some grow quieter, some grow resentful. Some begin, in the deepest chambers of their minds, to imagine a world beyond him. The end does not arrive with spectacle. It approaches on soft feet. Betrayal is born not from grand ideology, but from accumulated terror. Those closest to him carry the heaviest burden. They see the man behind the myth. They witness the sleepless nights, the sudden rages, the hollow stare that lingers too long on nothing. They understand that the machine cannot survive its creator's collapse. In their fear, they begin to believe that removing him is an act of preservation. The moment itself is intimate. No battlefield, no roaring army. Just breath, footsteps, the small sounds of proximity. He is unarmored, unguarded by the rituals that usually surround him. The men who approach carry the weight of history in trembling hands. You can almost feel the air tighten as they close the distance. For an instant, time stretches. The architect of an empire stands within reach of ordinary violence. The first strike is shockingly quiet. Flesh yields with a sound too small for the magnitude of the act. His eyes widen not in theatrical horror, but in recognition. He understands immediately. Power, stripped of ceremony, is just a body subject to gravity and pain. He staggers. More blows follow, urgent, desperate. The men do not shout. They breathe hard, as if afraid that sound itself might reverse what they have begun. He falls, and with him falls the illusion that myth can protect its vessel. The ground receives him without reverence. Dust clings to his skin the way it clung to the boy he once was. For a heartbeat, the world holds perfectly still. The machine pauses, sensing the absence at its center. Then sound returns. Distant voices, running feet, the confused murmur of a kingdom discovering that its axis has vanished. Silence follows the act, a silence heavier than any battlefield. The men who struck him stand over the body, already aware that they have crossed into a future none of them can fully predict. They have killed a king. They have also killed a structure that depended entirely on his breath. In that stillness, power reveals its final illusion. It was never immortal. It was borrowed from the fragile persistence of a single human heart. The world does not stop. The sun continues its climb. Warriors still march. Orders are still given. The system continues, but changed forever. Something essential has been removed, and everything that remains must reorganize around the vacancy. In the days after his death, the kingdom moves as if waking from a fever. Commands still echo across training grounds. Drums still summon men into formation. From a distance, the machine appears intact. But those who live inside it feel the difference immediately. The air is lighter and more uncertain. Authority now travels through many mouths instead of one. And in that multiplication, it loses the absolute clarity that once defined it. The structure survives, yet carries the imprint of the man who shaped it, like a mold retaining the outline of the vanished metal. Leaders step forward to inherit what cannot truly be inherited. They preserve the drills, the rituals, the rigid architecture of obedience because those forms have proven their power. But without the original architect's intensity, the system begins to breathe differently. Some restrictions loosen, some fears soften. The kingdom learns, cautiously, to exist without the constant pressure of his will. And still, every maneuver, every ceremony, every synchronized stamp of feet is a reminder that the present is walking inside a design left behind by the dead. Beyond the borders, others are watching. Enemies who once trembled now study the remnants with sharp attention. They copy what frightened them. They adopt fragments of his methods, reshaping their own armies in the image of the force that once dominated them. His innovations travel farther in death than they ever did in life. They detach from his name and become techniques, traditions, habits embedded in other people's. In this way, he spreads like a shadow cast long after the body has vanished. Stories begin to multiply around fires, in marketplaces, in the quiet spaces where memory ferments into legend. The man becomes larger than the life he lived. Some remember him as a tyrant whose ambition devoured his own people. Others speak of a visionary who carved unity out of chaos. The truth fractures into narratives that serve the needs of those telling them. He is no longer a single figure. He is a collection of meanings. You can imagine a child, years later, hearing his name for the first time. The child does not see a grieving ruler or a lonely architect pacing empty halls. The child sees a giant striding across history, a king who bent the world to his design. Myth replaces flesh because myth is easier to carry. It smooths contradictions. It sharpens edges. It offers clarity where the human life offered only complexity. The kingdom he forged continues to influence the shape of the land. Borders shift. Alliances form and dissolve. New leaders rise with echoes of his discipline in their voices. Even those who reject his memory cannot fully escape his architecture. He has altered the grammar of power in his region. Every subsequent sentence is written in a language he helped invent. That is the difference between empire and influence. Empires fall. Influence migrates. As years accumulate, his physical absence grows less shocking and more foundational. He becomes a reference point, a before and after. People speak of events in relation to him, measuring change against the standard of his reign. In this way, he achieves a strange continuity. Though his body returned to dust, his presence remains embedded in the way others imagine authority. He has crossed the threshold from man to symbol, and symbols do not age in the same way. Reflection settles over his story like evening light. With distance comes a quieter understanding. He was not a monster carved from pure cruelty, nor a hero sculpted from unbroken virtue. He was a human being who discovered how far willpower and design could stretch the boundaries of his world. He built something unprecedented, and in doing so revealed both the brilliance and the danger of concentrated power. His greatness and his brutality are inseparable threads in the same fabric. The hunger for order that animated his life is not unique to him. It lives in every society that fears collapse, in every leader who promises stability at any cost. Watching his rise and fall is like watching a magnified version of a recurring human impulse. We crave structure. We fear chaos. We elevate those who promise to protect us from uncertainty. And we are startled when their strength carries its own violence. His story is not an anomaly. It is an echo. There is a danger in worshiping strength without examining its foundation. A system built on fear can achieve astonishing efficiency, but fear is a corrosive material. It erodes trust. It isolates those at the top. It transforms loyalty into performance. He mastered fear as a tool, and in the end, the tool mastered him. The fragility of his kingdom was not hidden in its enemies. It was embedded in the imbalance of its design. And yet, history remembers both sides. Every act of domination is also an act of creation. He unified scattered peoples. He imposed a new coherence on a fractured landscape. He demonstrated that innovation can erupt from unlikely origins, that a child pushed to the margins can reconfigure the center. These accomplishments do not erase the suffering woven through them, but neither does the suffering erase the accomplishments. They coexist, demanding a more mature form of memory. Return now to the field at dawn. The grass has grown back. Wind moves freely across a plain that no longer bears visible scars. If you stood there without knowing, you would see only a quiet landscape, innocent of the violence that once defined it. This is history's final gesture. It absorbs everything. Blood sinks into soil. Cries dissolve into air. What remains is influence, invisible and persistent. The man who stood at the seam between eras is gone. The world he changed continues, shaped by decisions made in moments of clarity and moments of despair. His life reminds us that power is never abstract. It is always carried by a body, limited by a mind, vulnerable to grief. To understand him is not to excuse him or condemn him absolutely. It is to recognize the dangerous intimacy between human ambition and historical transformation. Quiet awe is the only honest response. Awe at what a single will can construct. Awe at how quickly that construction can turn against its creator. Awe at the resilience of the people who survive both the rise and the collapse. Empires rise and fall, but the human capacity to rebuild meaning from their ruins endures. The wind crosses the empty field, bending the grass in waves. There is no monument here, no inscription, only space, open and indifferent. Yet within that space lingers the imprint of a king who once believed he could engineer permanence. He cannot. No one can. What he achieved was something stranger and, in its way, more lasting. He altered the trajectory of those who came after him. The land is quiet again, but it is not the same quiet that followed the battle. This silence is older, deeper, filled with the accumulated memory of what has passed. If you listen carefully, you might imagine you can hear faint echoes, synchronized footsteps, distant chants, the breath of a man standing alone at the center of his creation. They fade as you focus on them.